We're into our second sermon in this wrestle with this moment where Jesus is on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection, and he's showing the disciples from the Old Testament all that it said about him. And if you, like me, have read your Old Testament, you won't find the name Jesus obviously there. And I remember thinking, gee, I would love to have heard what he was saying there. But we're trying to work out, if we were to look at our Bibles, what might he have shown them? And so last week we looked at the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible. Now, important to understand that for Jewish people, they call the first 5 books of the Bible the books of Moses. They call that the Torah, and it is kind of the sense is that Moses helped pen them all. Little complicated to explain how he wrote about his own death in that, but that they are called the books of Moses. And so when Jesus talks about Moses and all the prophets, he means the first 5 books of the Bible and then the books that come after that. Now, Genesis starts with this dilemma we spoke about last week that's true for all of us. This incredible truth that there's a beautiful part of you created in the image of God, but there's also a part of you that's pretty messy. And both of those are who you are. And so we see this dilemma right the way through the Bible. For all human beings, there's 2 sides to us. A beautiful spirit, the human spirit created in the image of God, and a messy part. And we then see in the book of Genesis, God reaching out for relationship despite the fall and despite the brokenness. And so from chapters 4 to 11, we see the sad story of Cain and Abel, Noah and the Tower of Babel. Chapters 12 to 36 is really the story of the promise. It's the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And Jacob gets another name. Who knows what Jacob's other name is? Israel. And so it's Jacob's kids that become the 12 tribes, kind of. Well, it's actually 10 of Jacob's kids and then 2 of Joseph, his son's kids. 2 of his sons sort of get a Guernsey, then they become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Abraham is a rich man with a big family, and Jacob is a rich man with a big family. And so what God does in order to make sure that we and they know it's not about them being rich and having a big family, he takes them off into Egypt. In one of the first descriptions of God's grace that we see happen in the Bible, and I call this like divine judo. In Genesis 50, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to hurt me, but God took what you intended for bad and turned it for good." In judo, you take the force of your enemy and apply it against them. And you'll see this as the pattern right the way through the Bible. The devil will do his worst. People will do their worst. And somehow God is able to take the mess and turn it into something beautiful. So Jacob's family, Israel's tribes, end up in Egypt. And they end up in Egypt for, listen to this, 430 years. So any sense of them being rich and powerful is completely taken away, and they are slaves in Egypt. To give us some kind of reference point, obviously white Australia is a lot younger than 430 years. So for us to get some kind of reference point, that's the same as from the time they arrive in Egypt to the time they leave Egypt. It's the same as today, back to the year William Shakespeare released his first ever play. that give you some kind of reference, back to the year 1594. As a 30-year-old, he released his first play called Titus Andronicus. And the way they talked back there and the way they thought back there, that's as far back as for the Israelite people in Egypt. And so one of the things that is absolutely clear, if you hang around Tassie, we tried a social experiment, and we created housing estates where we put all the people who are on welfare in the same community, and we thought we'd see what would happen. Well, we discovered what would happen. Those communities become more and more disadvantaged, and here in Tassie there are generations who have been unemployed and without a job and with family troubles because that's been passed down from generation to generation. Imagine how you would think about yourself, what your self-picture would be, if not only your parents were slaves, but your grandparents were slaves. Now, imagine that goes back for 430 years. I don't know how many generations that is. That's a couple of generations. How that would affect your self-picture. One of the things we see happen, we now move to the book of Exodus, and the first 18 chapters of Exodus are about Moses coming and leaving, helping the Israelites leave Israel. A case could be put that the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are about helping the Israelites get to the point where not only have they physically left Egypt, but they've actually emotionally left Egypt, that Egypt has left them. Now, I wonder for you, one of the challenges we all face this double-edged reality of the fact that there's a good part of us that just loves God and wants to love people. There's another side to us. One of the other challenges you face is you, like the Israelites, have inherited things from your family, from the previous generations. There are things you believe because of generations that have gone before you. Sometimes it's from your family, sometimes it's from your culture and your society, but there are things that have been passed down to you that were not true. Have there been times in your life when you've realised that things you inherited were not true? Have there been? Because we want to put ourselves in the shoes of Israel at this point. And we're going to do a Mentimeter, which is one of the things we do here. We want your opinion or your view, and I'd love you to think about what are some of the wrong beliefs that were passed down to you that you now realise are not helpful? What are some of the wrong beliefs that you now realise are not helpful? And if you're at home, we'd love you to be participating in this at Lena Valley. We're going to chuck the slide up now, Matt, so people can use this QR code. What wrong or unhealthy beliefs are passed down to you by previous generations? If you use that QR code, it'll take you to this question. And I really invite you to think about what are the things from previous generations that you need to leave behind? Because God said to Abraham he was going to choose these people, but in order to do that, he had to help them find a new identity. So everybody been able to access that QR code? Now, what wrong beliefs have been passed down? Be good to stop and think about that. So can you think of anything where you go, I realise, one of the things that you may have discovered is that it's okay to dance now. Or if you're Baptist, because there was a time. What sort of answers are we starting to get, Matt? Let's have a look. What wrong or unhealthy beliefs? Is that work is who I am, always be perfect, intolerance, racism, eye for an eye. This is so important to stop and think, what are the things that were passed down to you that you actually need to free yourself from? Really helpful. Thank you for those that have answered this so far. Essentially, racism's come up, eye for an eye. The environment cleans itself. It'd be convenient if that was true, but, binary thinking. intolerance, conform, perfectionism. Really helpful to see these. We are all on a journey to become free. We are all on a journey to become free. And what we see in the Old Testament is the God of the universe reaching for relationship and trying to form a people for himself. And so what we'll need, the Easter Bunny, somebody put that there as a wrong belief that was passed down to them. Fair enough. We're going to leave that, and the link to the results of this is in the YouVersion Bible app, so you can then, that's helpful, you can check it. I don't have anybody to read it at that size, but it's kind of cool to see the answers still coming in. Thanks, Matt. And so God uses Moses to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, and it's clear, he gets them to a point where it's absolutely clear that it's not because they're rich or clever. The only way they leave Egypt is because God intervenes. And one of the dangers for us is we can think our task is to be rich and clever and to earn God's favour. One of the story of the Bible is very clear. It is God who intervenes. And then we see in the book of Exodus, God giving a new mission statement, sort of a renewal of the covenant he gave to Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob. Now he says in Exodus, this is to Moses, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites, is what God tells Moses. So up to chapter 18 in Exodus, there's a story of leaving Egypt. And now God says, okay, now you've left, let's talk about what you need to become. And interestingly enough, this is a historic text in human history. This passage in Exodus chapter 19 is one of the first times in the whole of human history that there is any kind of monotheism. Up till now, there is a sense, and you'll see often in the Old Testament, this sense that God is the toughest out of all the gods. But here, God is kind of letting Israel know, hey, boys and girls, the whole earth is mine. I'm in charge. Those other gods, they're not real, is what. So in human history, this little passage here is historic. More than that, though, there are some words in there that carry profound meaning. The word a kingdom, the idea that they would be a kingdom of priests. A kingdom, as we've talked about before, is a place where a king is in charge. God had sent them off to Egypt for 430 years to bring them out in order that they would know that it's not about them being rich and clever, it's about them following his will, them following the king, a kingdom of priests. Now within Israel, there were priests that were there to serve Israel, but all of Israel were to be priests. And what is a priest? A priest is somebody who represents God to the people and the people to God. So all of Israel were to represent God to the world. They were not there for themselves. We said this last time. One of the dangers is for all of us is we get a bit self-focused and we think we're special. Oh, sorry, I dropped the microphone. What God wants Israel to know is, yes, you are my chosen people, but to be my kingdom of priests, to represent me to the world, not to be there to, enjoy the warm hugs from me, and to represent the world, to represent me to the world and represent the world to me. And he says, you will be a holy nation, a nation that is set apart, which is what holiness actually means. Sometimes, again, we get the wrong picture of holiness. We think it's sort of halos and shining and stuff. Holiness means being set apart. And God said, I have set you apart to be my representatives on the planet to show people what hope looks like. And so this is kind of the mission statement. And then in chapter 20, he begins explaining to them what that means. And we get the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And he unpacks that further. And Exodus sort of from 25 to 30 starts telling them what does it mean for him to be king. Then it's interesting, in chapter 31 we get the importance of Sabbath. He's already talked about Sabbath in the 10 Commandments, but and we've talked a bit about this. We've got a couple of sermons online on YouTube to go back and watch. It is so important to have a day off, is what Sabbath actually means. If you are not able to have a day off, then what you're saying in your actions is the world can't survive without you being in charge and taking action. That the world can't survive without you being in charge and taking action. And so having a day off is an act of faith. And so we see the Sabbath spoken about in chapter 31, and then in chapter 32 through to 34 we see Moses' terrible, very bad day. That's not exactly how it goes. What is that? Awful, terrible, very bad. There's a book about somebody's terrible, very bad day. Moses has one of those. You imagine you go up and have this incredible time with God, hear from God and get from God the secret to a healthy and whole life. And he gets it on tablets. And you come back down the mountain and the bloke you thought you needed to help you, Aaron, has let the people lose the plot. And they've built a calf in their own image. And they're worshipping this calf, and Moses gets so frustrated that he gets these 10 commandments. He gets the word of the law given to him by God and smashes them into a million bits. And then he has to trudge back up the mountain and say, have you got another copy? And so we actually, at that point, get to this moment where God kind of says, oh, you guys are pretty frustrating. I'd like to, I'm tempted to give up. What say we give up on Israel and we'll just have a crack with you and your family, Moses? Moses says, no, I need you to be with us, and I can't do this without you, and it would be not good for your name if we don't bring the whole of Israel with us. And he says to God, I don't want to do this without you. Have you ever had moments like that? I don't think I can do this. And then he says this line, now show me your glory. I said at the start of the service that I agree with Eugene Peterson, who says there's actually been a cover-up in the Christian church. This is what Eugene Peterson actually says. He says, one of the severe handicaps under which the church operates is the cover-up of the glory with respectable substitutes such as acceptance and honour, success and relevance. Over and over again we miss it. If you were to think about the word glory, because it comes up in some of our songs and it's very common in the New Testament, the word glory, what pictures come to mind for you with the word glory? What pictures? Shout it out. I'd like to hear. I can't quite hear Lena Valley. It'll be hard to hear those online. But for those here at Mornington, what pictures come to mind when you think of the word glory? Sovereignty. Yep. God's sovereignty. For others, what pictures come to mind? If you think of the word glory, if you were to think about how you would use the word glory. Radiance, yeah, and dies sort of power, radiance, yeah, light. That's kind of our common understanding. actually, those words don't really capture what the Bible means when it uses the word glory. See, Moses says, "Show me your glory." And what we get is Exodus chapter 34. You see, if we were to think of power, radiance, glory, this is Palm Sunday. You know, you'd think that Palm Sunday was the moment when Jesus was most glorified, when everybody's sort of clapping and cheering, going, "Hosanna, Hosanna, save now, save now." You would think that'd be the moment where Jesus was most glorified, wouldn't you? But there is actually another moment when Jesus says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." He had quite a different understanding of what glory meant. And do you know what that moment was? The moment when his best friend betrays him. The moment when his best friend betrays him in John 13:31. How can Palm Sunday not be when Jesus is glorified, and this dark, sad moment when your best friend is betraying you be the moment where God's glory is revealed? I really believe we in the Christian church have watered down the gospel because we've avoided this part of the Bible. We talk a lot more. I'm not going to get the chance to really unpack God's glory. We spend a lot more time unpacking it in the Foundations course. I believe it is one of the most important bits of Bible teaching to understand. It will affect not only your understanding of who Jesus is and what he did, but it gives you a path to a healthy life, a healthy family, a healthy workplace. The glory of God is one of the most important things to understand. And it is actually what we see, it is the most important part of the Old Testament. Just a couple of verses in Exodus chapter 34. Let's have a look at them. Exodus 34 verses 5 to 7. Renata read them. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of his parents to the third and fourth generation. So, what is it? What is this? This is Exodus 34, and I'm telling you, do you know this? The reason I say this is the most important part of the Old Testament, because it is the few verses in the Old Testament that are most quoted by the Old Testament. You'll see these pattern of words coming up in the Psalms and in Isaiah, and right the way through the Old Testament. They'll refer back to this, and it's quoted in pretty remarkable ways in the New Testament too. So it's clearly not light, is it? It's clearly not radiance. What is this? If you look at this passage of the Bible, what is it? You see, it is more than the fullness. It is God's character. It's what matters to God. And one of the challenges is it's multi-dimensional. Many of us have a one-dimensional God. Either a gentle Jesus, meek and mild, or a God who you've got to fit the boxes for and not, get in trouble from. What we have here is a beautiful few verses that talk about the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love. We also get this thing at the end that says he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. Many of us want a one-dimensional God, but you cannot follow the God of the universe and have a one-dimensional God. What we see here, God's glory, his revelation of who he is and what he cares about, is his love and his justice together. They're both. We see his mercy and compassion, and it's beautiful, but it's also balanced by his justice. Both of those are who God is. And if you try and make God a one-dimensional God that is only loving and merciful but not just, or only just and not loving and merciful, then it's not God. We find it hard. Many of us tend to be either justice people or mercy people. We find it hard to, manage both, but we water down the gospel when we try and fit God into a one-dimensional picture. God is both love and truth. He's not love or truth. And so we get this incredible picture of the glory of God revealed to Moses. And the rest of Exodus is the story of them building the tabernacle so the glory of God can hang out with them, the presence of God can hang out with them. And the end of the book of Exodus is this incredible story of the glory of God coming to be with them. And one of the things we need to hear in this is we get the law, we get the picture of what it means, but what sets these people apart is that God wants to hang out with them. He wants to do life with them. He wants to be with them. And so the glory comes and hangs out with the people of God. And then we have the book of Leviticus, which tells you some of the laws, and there's many, many ways in which Jesus comes and fulfills Leviticus, and I'm sure Jesus would have referred to that, but we're not going to go there this morning. And we also have the book of Numbers, which has a whole lot of numbers, but it also tells a lot of the story of the journey of the people of Israel. And then we get to the book of Deuteronomy. Now remember, Moses, when he starts his journey at the start of Exodus, tells God, I can't talk real well. So you better find someone who knows how to talk. And then we get the longest recorded sermon in history from Moses, which is Deuteronomy. And it's towards the end of his life, just as he's looking over the promised land, knowing they're getting close, the older generation have died off. And he's trying to prepare this next generation, and he tells them the important stuff. And one of the things he says is, there's someone coming. And I'm sure Jesus quotes this, Deuteronomy 18. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. He goes on and says, this is God talking now to Moses, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I'll put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I've commanded him. I myself will call to account anyone who doesn't listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. So this is Moses at the end of his life saying, someone's coming. Someone's coming, and when he comes, you better listen to him. And a whole lot of prophets do come, but for Israel, there's always this sense that there's this prophet to come who's going to fully and completely represent God's words. And one of the other things we need to understand, we're going to encounter this more as we get to Ezekiel, this incredible glory of God, the presence of God, the character of God that fills the temple. There's a tragic part of the book of Ezekiel where it leaves. It raises and leaves. And although they build another temple, there is no story of the glory coming back in that second temple. And Israel is both looking for a prophet who's going to come and looking for the one who's going to be a bit like Moses, but they're also waiting for the temple, the glory to come back. And I am sure this is what Jesus is telling them on the road to Emmaus. And I don't know if he dictates this directly to John, but did you know that John, in John 1:14, actually directly quotes Exodus 34? in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which was what John had available to him, he directly quotes Exodus 34. And what he says about who Jesus is this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The word there for dwelling is the word literally tabernacle. The Word became flesh. Jesus becomes flesh and makes his dwelling among us. He hangs out with us. We have seen his what? We have seen his glory. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of what? Grace and truth. That, where he's quoting grace and truth, is a direct quote from the Septuagint from Exodus 34. John goes on to finish this description of who Jesus is and what he did by saying, out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. You don't understand who Jesus is and what he was about until you begin to glimpse the impact of the glory of God and understand that on the cross, the full weight of God's justice meant the incredible beauty of his mercy and compassion. And in his life, Jesus made the glory of God visible. And we are called to live from that same justice and mercy and compassion that Jesus exhibited. But Paul writes in Colossians, it's not by working hard. It's not by sorting it out. One of the things that becomes incredibly obvious is Israel could not do it on its own. And we can't do it on our own. They needed the presence of God with them, but it wasn't until the prophet that Moses was pointing to, the glory that they were longing for would come. And when Jesus comes to the temple, he comes as the glory they're longing for, but he's not in the shape of a cloud. He's in the shape of the Son of God, whose death takes away the sins of the world. And Paul writes and he says, it's Christ in you, the hope of glory. As Christians, we are called to an additional tension beyond the human tension that we all have. We all have a human tension, that is, there's a human spirit created in the image of God, and there's a mess and a darkness, and we can be full of ourselves and full of it. That's all human beings. As followers of Jesus, we are called, as the Westminster Confession says, the chief end of man is to glorify God. What does that mean? It means that we are to live in the tension of justice and mercy and compassion. And you don't get to do an either or. And what makes, one of the things that we will show you in Foundations, is what makes a family work, what makes a government work, as our politicians are about to find out, is justice and mercy and compassion. You can't do either or. But as a human being, you can't resolve that tension. As Christians, we are called to live in the tension, and the only way it gets resolved on this side of eternity is in the shape of a cross. We're invited to take up our crosses. Live cross-shaped lives. And glorify God tangibly. Be agents of God's justice, his boundaries, and his mercy and his compassion. As a follower of Jesus, I hate to break the news to you, there is no one you're not called to love. That can be really difficult. But the other side of that is that love should never be a collapsing of boundaries. That love must always respect the individual and respect the separateness of the other. And I'd love to spend more time talking about this, and it's a theme right the way through the New Testament. But what John says, it's through Jesus that God is made known. It's through Jesus that God's glory is visible. And what we'll be showing you in the Foundations course, that the glory of God genuinely is the best hope your family has, is the best hope our government has, best hope our church has. And it's going to require you to be ready to take up a cross. Let's pray. Jesus, I've got no idea what went through Moses' mind when he said, "Show me your glory." And on behalf of the Christian church, I want to apologise. I think we've distanced ourselves from the idea of your justice and mercy and compassion because it's confronting. It's easier to want to, seek justice for people we don't like, or to look for mercy and compassion for ourselves. It's easier to want to collapse you and the Father into like a one-dimensional God. You don't let us get away with that. You come as a person, a three-dimensional person, into history. And you say, if you want to follow me, you need to get ready to die to yourself and take up your cross. Thank you that your glory, your justice, mercy, and compassion is the foundation of the world. It is how this world works. Thanks that there is a path to life and a path to healthy families and communities. But Jesus, can you help us? Can you help us face the stuff in us that would hold us back from justice, that would hold us back from care and love, and would seek to reduce the world to black and white and the problem being out there? Help us know how much you love us. Jesus, help us glimpse what that cross meant so that we can truly glorify you. As Paul said, it is Christ in you, the hope of glory. We need your help. Amen.